The desert sun beat down on the fortress port like a hammer against an anvil. Inside the crumbling walls, 14,000 Australian soldiers checked their ammunition and waited. They could see the dust clouds on the horizon. German tanks were coming, lots of them. General Leslie Morshead stood on the fortress wall and looked out at the enemy positions through his field glasses. He was 51 years old, with a weathered face and steady hands. Before the war, he had been a school teacher. He taught children their numbers and letters in a small Australian town. Now he was in command of the 9th Australian Division, trapped in a port that everyone said would fall within days. The situation was bad, really bad. Just 3 weeks earlier, Rommel's Afrika Korps had smashed through every British defence in North Africa. They moved like lightning across the sand. British generals with fancy titles and expensive educations had tried to stop them. All of them failed. Some positions fell in hours. Others lasted a day or two at most. The pattern was always the same. The Germans attacked. The defenders broke, the survivors ran. Tobruk was supposed to be next. The fortress sat on the Mediterranean coast, surrounded on 3 sides by empty desert. German forces had already cut off all the roads. No supplies could get in by land. No reinforcements could arrive. The only way out was by sea, and German planes controlled the skies during daylight. Ships could only come and go in darkness, and even then the risk was huge. British command in Cairo studied their maps and made plans for evacuation. They had seen this movie before. They knew how it ended. The smart move was to get the troops out before Rommel tightened the noose completely. Save the men to fight another day. Lose the port, but keep the army. It made perfect sense. Rommel himself believed victory was certain. His intelligence officers told him the fortress held mostly Australian troops with limited armour and artillery. His own forces included battle-tested German divisions with hundreds of tanks and massive artillery support. He had never failed to break a siege, not once. In his diary, he wrote that Tobruk was a mere formality that would fall within days. He was already planning his next moves, his advance into Egypt, maybe all the way to the Suez Canal. Inside the fortress, the Australians could hear the German artillery finding its range. Shells screamed overhead and exploded against the old Italian fortifications. The walls shook. Dust and sand filled the air. The smell of explosives mixed with the salt smell of the sea. At night, they could see the enemy campfires stretching across the desert in every direction. There were so many fires, too many to count. The British officers who remained in Tobruk spoke quietly about the odds. They had been through North Africa's disasters. They had watched superior positions crumble under German assault. One colonel told his staff that evacuation was the only sensible option. Another said the Australians were brave but inexperienced in desert warfare against a modern mechanised force. The subtext was clear. These colonial troops from the other side of the world, led by a former school teacher, were about to learn a hard lesson about real war. Morshead heard the whispers. He understood the math. 14,000 defenders against forces 3 times that size, with better equipment and unbroken momentum. Every expert, every calculation, every bit of military wisdom said the same thing. Tobruk would fall. The only question was how many days it would take. But Leslie Morshead had not come halfway around the world to surrender. He had not survived the trenches of the First World War by accepting what everyone said was inevitable. He looked at the same situation the British generals saw, and he saw something different. He saw soldiers who could be taught, defences that could be improved, tactics that could turn weakness into strength. On April 10th, Morshead called together his officers. The meeting room was hot and stuffy. Maps covered the walls. Outside, German artillery continued its steady pounding. The officers expected orders for stage withdrawal, plans for evacuation, instructions on which equipment to destroy before leaving. Instead, Morshead stood before them and said words that would echo through military history. "There will be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we shall fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." The room went silent. Some officers looked at each other. One captain cleared his throat. They had all heard about Dunkirk, where over 300,000 British and French troops evacuated from France the year before. It was considered a miracle of survival. Now this general was saying survival was not the plan. Morshead continued. His voice was calm, but absolutely firm. While British command planned escape routes, he would design something else. Something no one had tried against Rommel's war machine. Not a static defence that waited for the enemy to break through. Not a fighting retreat that gave up ground to save lives. An elastic defence that would bend, but not break. A system where every German attack would be met with immediate counterattack. Where the enemy would bleed for every metre of ground. The officers began to understand. This was not caution. This was not the defensive thinking the British generals criticised. This was something aggressive disguised as defence. Morshead was not planning to hold Tobruk. He was planning to turn it into a trap where German forces would break themselves against defenders who refused to be broken. Outside, the German artillery intensified. The first major assault would come soon. Rommel's tanks were moving into position. His infantry was preparing. He expected quick victory. He expected the pattern to repeat. He expected the Australians to break like everyone else had. He was about to discover he had made a terrible miscalculation. Morshead wasted no time turning his words into action. Within hours of that meeting, his officers spread across the 30-mile perimeter of Tobruk with measuring tapes, compasses and notebooks. They were not just inspecting the defences, they were redesigning them from the ground up. The general system was built on mathematics and psychology. Every machine gun position had to cover a specific area measured in exact degrees. When crews set up their weapons, they used string and stakes to mark precise firing angles. The goal was simple, but deadly. No matter where German infantry attacked, they would walk into overlapping fields of fire from at least 3 positions. Even if they knocked out one gun, 2 others would still tear them apart. But the real innovation was what happened next. Morshead trained his troops to do something that went against every defensive instinct. When Germans broke through any position, the Australians would not fall back. They would not dig in deeper. Within 15 minutes, soldiers from nearby positions would launch immediate counterattacks to take back every metre of lost ground. The Germans would never be allowed to consolidate gains. They would never get comfortable. They would never feel like they were winning. Every night, Morshead sent out between 70 and 80 patrols into no man's land. These were not reconnaissance missions. These were hunting parties. Small groups of Australian soldiers crawled through the darkness, looking for German positions, cutting wire, laying mines, and ambushing enemy patrols. The Germans called it ratting, because the Australians seemed to appear from nowhere, strike fast, and disappear back into their holes. The name was meant as an insult. The Australians wore it like a medal. Morshead instituted one more rule that shocked some of his officers. 0 tolerance for retreat. Every position would be defended to the last man. Any soldier who abandoned his post without orders would face immediate court-martial. It sounded harsh. It sounded like something from another century. But Morshead understood something about human nature. If soldiers knew retreat was not an option, they fought differently, harder, smarter. They found ways to survive because they had no choice but to win. The first test came on April 13th. The date was etched into every defender's memory. At dawn, German artillery opened up with everything they had. Shells fell like rain across the fortress. The explosions were so constant they merged into one endless roar. Dust and smoke blocked out the sun. Men pressed themselves into the bottom of trenches and prayed the walls would not collapse on top of them. Then came the tanks, dozens of them spread across the desert in neat formations. Behind the tanks marched German infantry in their grey uniforms. They moved with confidence. They had done this many times before. They expected the Australians to break and run like the British had done. Like everyone had done, the Germans hit the northern sector first. They pushed forward through the outer defences, their tanks crushing wire and crossing trenches. For a moment, it looked like the pattern would hold. The unstoppable German advance meeting the breakable Allied defence. But then the Australian machine guns opened up. Not random fire, not panic shooting. Precise, measured bursts from positions the Germans had not spotted. The overlapping fields of fire Morshead had designed cut into the German infantry like invisible scythes. Men fell in clusters. The advance slowed, stalled. German tanks pushed deeper, reaching the second line of trenches. They overran 2 Australian positions. The crews fought to the last man, just as Morshead had ordered. German soldiers jumped into the captured trenches, expecting to consolidate and push forward. That was when the counterattacks hit. Australian soldiers came from both sides, moving fast and low. They threw grenades into the captured positions. They fired at point-blank range. They fought with bayonets and rifle butts. Within 15 minutes, the Germans were driven out. The positions were back in Australian hands. The bodies of both sides lay tangled together in the blood-soaked sand. The attack continued for 2 days and nights. Wave after wave of German infantry and armour crashed against the defences. They gained ground measured in metres. They lost it again just as fast. When the assault finally stopped on April 14th, German commanders counted their losses. 1,200 men killed or wounded. 400 metres of ground captured, then lost. 0 breakthrough achieved. In his command post, Rommel studied the reports with growing frustration. His intelligence had been wrong. These were not inexperienced colonial troops. These were soldiers who fought with what he called remarkable tenacity. His diary noted something even more troubling. Even wounded Australians refused to surrender. They kept fighting until they could not lift their weapons. Over the next weeks, Rommel tried again, and again, and again. He launched 4 major assaults, 32 separate infantry attacks, countless probing actions looking for weak points in the defence. Each time, the pattern repeated. German forces would fight their way into the Australian positions. Each time, the immediate counterattacks would drive them out. It was like punching a rubber wall. The wall would give a little, absorb the blow, then snap back. The nightly patrols drove the Germans to distraction. They could not sleep. They could not relax. Every night brought the sound of explosions, gunfire, and screaming in the darkness. Every morning brought new casualties and new destroyed equipment. The Australians were not just defending, they were hunting. One German officer wrote home in a letter, later captured by Allied forces. "We are not fighting human beings here. We are fighting some kind of devils who know no fear and feel no pain. At night, they come like ghosts. In the day, they cannot be moved from their positions. I do not know how to defeat an enemy who will not be defeated." Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Tobruk did not fall. The German advance into Egypt could not continue while Australian forces held the fortress behind their lines. 4 full German divisions, desperately needed elsewhere, remained tied down trying to break soldiers who would not break. The siege continued through the brutal desert summer. Temperatures hit 120 degrees. Water was rationed to 1 gallon per man per day for drinking, cooking and washing. Flies swarmed everywhere. Disease spread through the cramped positions. Supplies came only by ship at night, and German planes sank many vessels before they could unload. Through it all, Morshead's Australians held 241 days of constant siege, 6,000 German casualties for no gain, 3,000 Australian losses while keeping the fortress intact. The first major Allied victory against Nazi Germany. And it came from a former school teacher who refused to accept what everyone said was impossible. By the time the siege finally ended in October 1941, the numbers told a story that shocked the world. Tobruk held for 241 days. Not 2 days like other positions. Not 2 weeks. 8 full months of siege warfare where everyone expected collapse within a week. The fortress that was supposed to be Rommel's stepping stone to Egypt became his stone wall. 4 entire German divisions sat outside those walls, unable to advance, unable to retreat, bleeding men and equipment while achieving nothing. British morale transformed overnight. For months the news from every front had been terrible. German victories in Europe, Japanese victories in Asia, defeat after defeat after defeat. Then came Tobruk. Suddenly there was proof that German forces could be stopped, could be hurt, could be made to fail. Newspapers in London ran headlines calling the defenders the Rats of Tobruk. The name came from German propaganda broadcasts meant to insult the Australians, calling them rats hiding in holes. The Australians loved it. They painted rats on their vehicles. They called themselves the Rats with Pride. German intelligence created a new designation in their reports. When they identified Australian units, especially those that had served at Tobruk, they added warnings. Extreme caution required. Expect fierce resistance. Do not expect rapid breakthrough. These notations appeared nowhere else, not for British units, not for American units, only for the Australians who had learned to fight under Moorehead's iron discipline. But the real test was still to come. Halfway around the world, another war was raging. The Japanese military machine had rolled across Asia like an avalanche. They crushed British forces in Singapore. They overran Dutch positions in Indonesia. They pushed American forces out of the Philippines. In every jungle, on every island, the pattern held. Japanese infantry attacked with fanatical courage. Defenders broke and ran. Victory came fast. By mid-1942, Japanese forces stood at the doorstep of Australia itself. They had landed on the northern coast of New Guinea, just across the narrow strait from the Australian mainland. Their target was Port Moresby on the southern coast. If they captured that port, they could launch air attacks on Australian cities. They could prepare for invasion. The strategic situation was desperate. The only thing standing between the Japanese and Port Moresby was a narrow jungle track called the Kokoda Track. It ran through some of the worst terrain on Earth. Mountains rose 6,000 feet. Rain fell constantly, turning paths into rivers of mud. The temperature hit 100 degrees during the day. Disease was everywhere. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone. Australian militia forces, mostly untrained volunteers, tried to hold the track. They fought bravely. They died in huge numbers. Slowly, inevitably, they fell back. The Japanese kept coming. Their jungle warfare tactics were perfect for this environment. Small units moving fast through the forest. Sudden attacks from unexpected directions. Defensive positions built so well that artillery barely scratched them. MacArthur, now Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, watched the situation with alarm. He issued orders and moved units around on maps. But he favoured American generals for the actual fighting. Moorehead, despite his proven record, was sidelined. The assumption was clear. Desert warfare and jungle warfare were completely different. Success in one meant nothing for the other. That assumption nearly cost Australia the war. American forces landed at Boona and Gona on the New Guinea coast in November 1942, intending to drive the Japanese back. They expected to crush the enemy positions within weeks. Instead, they ran straight into a nightmare. Japanese engineers had built defensive positions unlike anything the Americans had seen. Bunkers made from coconut logs that could stop tank shells. Firing positions dug so deep into the ground that grenades rolled off harmlessly, interlocking fields of fire that made every approach a killing ground. The American attack stalled, then stopped completely. Casualties mounted, disease ravaged the units. Some companies lost half their men without gaining a single metre of ground. MacArthur, watching his plans collapse, finally made the call he should have made from the start. He ordered Morshead to take command. Morshead arrived in September 1942 to a situation that would have broken most generals. The terrain was alien. He had spent years mastering desert warfare. Now he stood in jungle so thick you could not see 10 metres in any direction. The heat was suffocating. The humidity made every breath feel like drowning. Rain fell in sheets that turned the ground into a swamp. His soldiers stood waist-deep in mud, covered in leeches, shaking with malaria, facing an enemy that had never been defeated in jungle combat. The Japanese defenders at Buna and Gona watched the change in command with interest. They had studied their opponents. American forces attacked with courage, but broke under sustained fire. Australian militia fought hard, but lacked training and equipment. Now came something different. These were the divisions from Tobruk, the ones German intelligence had warned about, the ones that would not break. Morshead walked the front line, studying the Japanese positions through field glasses. He saw bunkers built with incredible skill. He saw firing positions that covered every approach. He saw defences that had stopped everything thrown at them. And he saw the same problem he had faced at Tobruk. Everyone expected him to fail. Everyone had reasons why success was impossible. The Japanese positions were too strong. The jungle was too thick. The supply lines were too long. The disease was too bad. He gave the same answer he had given in the desert. His troops would attack. They would not retreat. They would take ground and hold it. They would counterattack immediately if pushed back. The Japanese would learn what the Germans had learned. You cannot break soldiers who refuse to be broken. The assault on Buna Gona began in late November. Australian troops moved forward through mud that sucked at their boots. The heat was over 100 degrees. Humidity near 100%. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies and disease. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Every man was sick with something. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery. They kept moving. Japanese machine guns opened up from bunkers the Australians could barely see. Men fell. The advance slowed, but it did not stop. When Japanese counterattacks came, the Australians hit back immediately, driving the enemy back into their bunkers. Flamethrower teams moved forward, pouring fire into the coconut log fortifications. Engineers placed charges against bunker walls. Infantry followed up, clearing positions room by room. The scene was hell on earth. Men fought through swamps where bodies floated in stagnant water. They attacked bunkers so well built that even flamethrowers barely worked. They advanced metre by metre through mud that rose to their waists. At night, Japanese soldiers infiltrated Australian positions, leading to close quarters, fighting in total darkness. The sounds were terrible. Grenades exploding in enclosed spaces, men screaming, the crack of rifle fire at point-blank range. But the pattern held. The Australians pushed forward, took ground, held it, pushed forward again. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to enemies that broke under pressure, found themselves facing troops that would not break, no matter what. These were men who had stood against Rommel in the desert sun. The jungle was just a different kind of hell, and they had already proven they could endure hell. The battle lasted 2 months, 60 days of constant combat in the worst conditions imaginable. When it finally ended in January 1943, Buna and Gona were in Allied hands, the first defeat of Japanese ground forces in the Pacific War. The casualty ratio was roughly even, despite the Australians attacking fortified positions where defenders normally had huge advantages. Captured Japanese intelligence reports, found later in the war, contained specific notations about Moorehead's divisions. Uncommonly stubborn even by Australian standards. Requires special attention and overwhelming force. One report stated simply, "These units do not surrender. Plan accordingly." Interestingly, while MacArthur's name appeared in Japanese strategic reports about overall Allied command structure, Moorehead's name appeared in tactical field reports with warnings for frontline commanders. The Japanese feared MacArthur's authority. They feared Moorehead's soldiers. When the war ended in 1945, the world celebrated its heroes. MacArthur returned to ticker tape parades in American cities. His image appeared on magazine covers and newsreels. Historians wrote books about his island-hopping campaign and his dramatic return to the Philippines. Schools taught children his famous quotes. Statues went up in his honour. His name became synonymous with victory in the Pacific. Leslie Moorehead went home to Australia and returned to his business career. He became the managing director of a large company. He wore suits instead of uniforms. He took the train to work like any other businessman. When reporters asked for interviews, he usually declined. When military historians wanted to write about Tobruk or New Guinea, he gave brief, modest answers and suggested they talk to the soldiers who did the actual fighting. The contrast was striking. MacArthur gave grand speeches about destiny and honour. Moorehead quietly ran board meetings and reviewed quarterly reports. MacArthur received medals from multiple nations. Moorehead accepted a knighthood, but rarely used the title. MacArthur's memoirs filled hundreds of pages. Moorehead left behind mostly official reports and a few letters. But in the places that mattered, Moorehead's influence ran deep. The Australian military studied everything he had done. They took apart his defensive system at Tobruk piece by piece. They analysed his counterattack doctrine. They examined his leadership style. Slowly, quietly, they built it into the foundation of how Australian forces would train and fight for generations to come. The result became known unofficially as the Moorehead Principle, though he never called it that himself. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Defence is not passive. You defend by attacking. When pushed back, you counterattack immediately. You never let the enemy rest. You never let them feel safe. You never ever accept that ground once taken cannot be retaken. Bend, but do not break. Give ground if you must, then take it back. Make the enemy pay for every metre until they decide the cost is too high. Australian military academies started teaching a new kind of leadership, not the charismatic general who gives inspiring speeches, not the brilliant tactician who wins through clever manoeuvres. Instead, they taught the Moorehead model. Lead by example, set clear standards, enforce iron discipline. Take care of your soldiers, but demand everything from them. Make surrender not just forbidden, but unthinkable. Create units where retreat is not part of the vocabulary. The tactical innovation spread even further. The practice of aggressive night patrols became standard. The concept of immediate counterattacks after any loss of position entered training manuals. The mathematics of overlapping fields of fire were taught to every machine gun crew. Future Australian soldiers learned to fight the way Tobruk's defenders had fought, even if they did not always know where those tactics came from. Foreign military observers noticed something strange about Australian units in later conflicts. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, when Australian soldiers held a position, they held it differently than other forces. They patrolled more aggressively. They counterattacked more quickly. They seemed to have a different relationship with the concept of defensive warfare. Allies learned to appreciate having Australians on their flanks because those flanks simply did not collapse. The enemy learned something different. They learned to expect fanatical resistance even from small Australian units. They learned that pushing Australians back from a position meant those Australians would counterattack as soon as darkness fell. They learned that surrounding Australian forces did not lead to surrender, but to break-out attempts that often succeeded. The reputation built at Tobruk and maintained at Bunagona echoed through decades of warfare. Meanwhile, military historians digging through German and Japanese archives after the war found something fascinating. Both enemies had identified Mooreshead by name in intelligence reports. Both had created special designations for units under his command. Both had warned their own forces that conventional tactics might not work against his soldiers. German documents from North Africa specifically mention Mooreshead's defensive system as requiring new approaches. One report recommended avoiding direct assaults on Australian positions in favour of trying to bypass them entirely. Another suggested that German forces should expect casualty ratios 3 times higher when fighting Australian units compared to British units, simply because the Australians would counterattack every gain. Japanese intelligence went even further. After Bunagona, they created detailed studies of how Mooreshead's forces had broken through positions that had stopped American attacks. The reports noted that Australian units appeared to have different morale standards. They did not break under sustained fire. They did not surrender when surrounded. They maintained discipline even when disease and casualties had reduced units to half strength. One Japanese colonel wrote that fighting Australian forces under Mooreshead was like fighting an enemy that had no reverse gear. They could only move forward or hold position. Backward was not an option they seemed to understand. These assessments appeared nowhere else in German or Japanese intelligence about Allied forces. Mooreshead had created something genuinely feared by both enemies. Not a larger army, not better weapons, not brilliant strategy, just soldiers who absolutely would not quit under any circumstances, led by a general who had figured out how to make that mindset into a tactical weapon. When Mooreshead died in 1959, his obituary in Australian papers was respectful but relatively brief. He was remembered as a successful general and businessman. The funeral was dignified but not grand. No massive crowds lined the streets. No foreign dignitaries gave speeches. It was the send-off for a man who had done his duty and then returned to normal life without seeking glory. But in military circles around the world, his passing was noted differently. British military journals ran detailed articles about his defensive innovations. American war colleges included his tactics in their curriculum. Israeli defense forces, studying how to defend against larger enemies, examined his Tobruk strategy. Soviet military theorists wrote papers analyzing his counterattack doctrine. The question that lingered was simple. Why did enemies fear Mooreshead more than MacArthur, when MacArthur was the supreme commander, the public face of Allied victory, the general everyone knew by name? The answer revealed something profound about the nature of fear in warfare. MacArthur was feared because he commanded vast resources. He had divisions of troops, fleets of ships, squadrons of aircraft. He could overwhelm enemies through sheer scale. That kind of fear is rational. It is the fear of knowing you will probably lose because the other side is simply too big and too strong. Mooreshead created a different kind of fear, the irrational kind, the kind that keeps soldiers awake at night, the kind that makes veterans shake their heads and refuse to talk about certain battles. It was not fear of being defeated. It was fear of an enemy that cannot be defeated no matter what you do to them. Fear of soldiers who will not break even when breaking is the sensible thing to do. Fear of fighting people who have somehow removed surrender from their list of options. German soldiers who survived Tobruk told stories for decades afterward about the Australians who kept coming back no matter how many times they were driven off. Japanese veterans of New Guinea spoke quietly about enemies who fought through conditions that should have made combat impossible. Both groups had fought British troops, American troops, Soviet troops, and dozens of others. They reserved special mention for Moorehead's Australians. Fame and fear are different currencies in war. MacArthur won the first, Moorehead won the second. History remembers MacArthur because he was larger than life, dramatic, quotable. But the soldiers who actually fought remembered Moorehead because he represented something more terrifying than dramatic genius. He represented inevitability. His troops would come. They would not stop. They could not be broken. Eventually, somehow, they would win. Not through brilliance, but through sheer refusal to lose. In the end, perhaps that is the lesson. The generals history celebrates are not always the ones the enemy truly feared. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is not the one with the best strategy or the most resources. Sometimes it is simply the one who will not quit. The one who turns ordinary soldiers into something that cannot be stopped because they genuinely believe stopping is not an option. The former school teacher who taught his students one final lesson, that the human will, properly disciplined and directed, can become a weapon more fearsome than any tank or bomb. And that lesson, unlike fame, does not fade with time. It builds into the bones of an army and stays there for generations. Still feared, still remembered, still effective. That was Leslie Moorehead's true legacy. Not the glory, the fear.